You know, the prophet Amos is a really astute observer of human nature. Today, in our first reading, he gives us a vision of humanity that I think was true at the time, and that's true today as well for many of us. Right? This is what he says. They hate the one who reproves in the gate, and they abhor the one who speaks the truth. Now, to understand what Amos is saying, it's important to understand this business about the gate, right? What does he mean by the gate? They hate the one who reproves in the gate. Well, in Amos's culture in ancient Israel, about 2,700 years ago, 2,800 years ago, the gate, in addition to obviously being the way you entered your town or city, the gate was also the place of public meeting. If you wanted to accuse someone of something, or you wanted to hold, the equivalent of a town hall meeting, you would gather at the gate. And when the person you wanted to accuse came up, you would stop them. And because others would gather at the gate in the morning and in the evening, you would have a sort of public assembly where you could make your accusation, or you could raise whatever issue you wanted to talk about. So when Amos says they hate the one who reproves in the gate, and they abhor the one who speaks the truth, what he's getting at is that, people don't like to be judged. People don't want their misdeeds to be publicized. They don't like other people to confront them. And what was true, of course, 2,700 years ago, I think is true today, right? We don't like to be judged. If we call someone judgmental, that's not a compliment. And this week as I was thinking about this, I actually found myself wondering about this one little question. What's worse? Is it worse to be judged for something that we didn't do, right? For someone to judge us unfairly? Or is it worse to be judged for something that we did do, right? To be judged fairly? They're both really uncomfortable, but in different ways. When we're judged unfairly, we get resentful and angry and frustrated. I didn't do that. That's not fair. But when we're judged rightly, I think we often feel a sort of a shame and embarrassment, right? Where we think to ourselves, gosh, I'm being judged. But you know what? They're kind of right about it. Amos, I think, makes the point that whether it's fairly or unfairly, we don't like to be judged. We don't like to be judged by other people. And I don't think we like to be judged by God either, right? We don't like to be judged by humans, and we don't like to be judged by God. If someone uses the phrase divine judgment, that has a sort of ominous feel to it, doesn't it? If we talk about Judgment Day, right, in our culture, Judgment Day, that's not meant to be a positive sort of hopeful term. We get images of fire and brimstone and all sorts of terrible things. We don't want to be judged by our fellow humans, whether fairly or unfairly, and we don't want to be judged by God. But this raises a question: what exactly is God's judgment? We use this phrase a lot, but I'm not sure we have any sense of what it is. What is God's judgment? Well, Amos is really helpful for us if we have that question, because Amos gets into some specifics about what it is that God is judging. He doesn't just announce God's judgment in general to scare people. He gets specific. Here's what Amos says, or here's what God says through God's prophet Amos. God judges those who, quote, afflict the righteous, those who take a bribe, and those who push aside the needy. God judges those who afflict the righteous, those who are violent against other people. God judges those who take a bribe. God judges dishonesty. And God judges those who push aside the needy. God judges exploitation and oppression and greed. Okay, so God judges violence, dishonesty, and greed. When you put it that way, it actually sounds kind of reasonable. All this ominous talk about this divine judgment and the day of judgment, which can kind of be scary, well, it comes down to God judges the things that I think we judge too. Violence, dishonesty, and greed. Hopefully we can all agree that these are things that we should judge. These aren't things that we want. Amos goes on, not just to talk about what God judges, but what God calls for instead of judgment, or instead of violence, dishonesty, and greed. God says this: hate evil, that seems fair, and love good, again, sounds great, and establish justice. And here's this second word, justice. We humans don't like judgment, but I think we do like justice. We talk about impartial justice. We talk about swift and fair justice. We talk about social justice. We talk about wanting our society and our lives to be more just. So, we don't want judgment, but we do want justice. But part of what Amos is telling us is that's not how it works. Indeed, I think Amos is telling us something really important here, and it's this: God's judgment is God's justice. That is, if we want more space for goodness, we want space for a peaceful and honest and equitable world, we have to be willing to judge what's evil. We have to be willing to judge violence and dishonesty and greed. It doesn't necessarily mean that we judge the people who do those things, especially when we remember that we oftentimes are the people who do those things. But we judge those actions and we say the world needs less of that, less evil and more good. We have to be willing to judge what is evil, or accept God's judgment of what is evil. Because that's the thing. God's justice ultimately is about being changed. To hate evil, to reduce evil, and to bring more good means to change the world, to try to heal the world, to try to repair the world. God's justice tries to move us from what is broken to what is whole. God's judgment is trying to move us from injustice to justice. And so we discover a third movement here, something strange, I think something unexpected. God's judgment is God's justice, and God's justice is actually God's grace. This is the strange thing. We discover that judgment, which sounds bad and harsh, is actually justice, which sounds better. And that justice is really God's grace, which sounds really good. Because God's grace is that transforming love, trying to move us from brokenness to whole, trying to move us from woundedness to being healed. And I think what we discover, what Amos is trying to tell us, is that if we resist God's grace, if we see God working in the world, trying to end violence, to end dishonesty, to end exploitation and greed, if we resist that movement, then we feel it as judgment. But if we accept the truth of what God is saying, and we actually try to cooperate and participate in God's healing of the world, then that same presence, which we could feel as judgment, we instead feel as grace. God's judgment is God's justice, and God's justice is God's grace. It's strange, but I think we hear Amos telling us that judgment and grace, at least divine judgment and divine grace, are two sides of the same coin. As different as they might seem, two sides of the same coin. Now, today we celebrate the feast of Thurgood Marshall. And Thurgood Marshall, of course, was a longtime member of St. Augustine's, although he was much more famous for some other things that he did. Thurgood Marshall was a judge and eventually a Supreme Court justice. And maybe you can see what I've been doing with these words, right? He was a judge and he was a justice. And I think that Thurgood Marshall understood that justice, real justice, requires judgment. Real justice requires judgment. Not judgmentalness, not pettiness, and not denouncing or judging human beings as worthy or unworthy, but judgment, fair, clear-eyed, and honest judgment of what is good and what is bad. Accepting God's judgment of everything that destroys life so that we can make space, so that we can participate in God making space for what is good and life-giving. I think Thurgood Marshall would agree, I hope that Thurgood Marshall would agree, that if we're going to serve God, we must be willing to pass judgment on what is evil, on what destroys life. Now, Thurgood Marshall had this extraordinary career that stretched over, I think, more than 5 decades. He worked as an attorney for the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. He served as an attorney for that organization for nearly 2 decades. Then he was called to serve as a federal judge at the Second Circuit Court of Appeals and served as a judge for a number of years there. Then Lyndon Johnson called Thurgood Marshall to be the Solicitor General in the Department of Justice. He only served there for just a few years, I think about 2 or 3 years, because then he was called to serve as a justice on the Supreme Court, the first African American to serve as a justice on the Supreme Court. It's an extraordinary career, and throughout Thurgood Marshall's career, of course, he showed this deep commitment to the battle for civil rights, the battle for African Americans to actually take equality, take their fair share of America's political and economic resources. Thurgood Marshall fought for social justice, for real, impartial justice. You know, on the front of the Supreme Court building, it says, "Equal justice under law." And I think Thurgood Marshall was actually committed to that idea in a way that, unfortunately, not all of our public figures are. And I think that it would be fair to say, I hope that it would be fair to say that you could summarize Thurgood Marshall's career, this long sweep. You could summarize his career by saying this: Thurgood Marshall believed that justice comes when we are willing to live out God's judgment of everything that is broken, everything that destroys human life. So we discover that, yes, it's true that God's judgment is God's justice, and God's justice is God's grace. But of course, the equation works the other way around too. God's grace is God's justice, and God's justice is God's judgment. We have to be willing to speak honestly about what is broken. So what does that mean for us today in 2020? What can we learn from Amos and from Thurgood Marshall? We can learn a lot. We could fill volumes with what we can learn from Amos and Thurgood Marshall. But I'll tell you one thing that I think we have to learn today. We have to judge, for example, the murder of Ahmaud Arbery, who was killed in late February, but many of you would have been aware of his murder only maybe in the last few weeks when a video of his shooting appeared online and ignited sort of national attention. We have to remember, there can be no justice if we are not willing to judge rightly. This man, Ahmaud Arbery, a young man in his 20s, an African-American man, was out on a jog, and he was basically hunted down by 2 men and shot. Or I should say, 2 men have been accused of hunting him down and shooting him. No one's been convicted of anything yet, and we should be clear about that. But the video, unfortunately, is pretty clear. The men who were accused of murdering Ahmaud Arbery seem to have been acting from a lot of impulses that I think Amos talked about today, right? These men got in a pickup truck and put a shotgun in the pickup truck and chased Ahmaud Arbery. They seem to have a lust for violence. And it seems like that they targeted him for his race, that they saw this African-American man and they jumped to a bunch of conclusions about him. So they were motivated by racism, by deception, by an illusion, by dishonesty. And they're motivated as well by selfishness, this desire to impose their will on someone else. Violence, racism, and selfishness. These are some of the things that God judges. If we're going to have justice, we have to be willing to judge these actions as evil. That doesn't mean that we deny that these 2 men are humans, that they're made in the image of God, that God loves them too, but we judge what they do. We must judge what they do, what they have done, or again, what they have been accused of doing. To put it another way, God's justice must mean the end of white supremacy. God's kingdom is not going to come into this world as long as white supremacy is alive and well. We must be willing to pronounce God's judgment on white supremacy. Full stop. And yet again, even as I say that, I discover that strange logic. Because God's judgment really is God's grace. God's judgment on white supremacy seeks to liberate people of color from violence and exploitation and oppression. God mourns and God cries out for everyone who is the victim of racist violence and racist oppression and exploitation. That's absolutely true. But here's the thing. God's judgment is also meant to liberate us white people from this demonic possession that we call white supremacy. God's judgment of white supremacy seeks to liberate people of color from violence and exploitation, but it also seeks to liberate white people from this hatred, from this illusion. We don't have to give ourselves to hate. We can live for something else. We can live for justice and for love. And this is the strange thing that Amos, I think, teaches us. To be judged by God, if we accept that judgment, if we admit that God's judgment is fair, then we can be changed by it. And to be transformed by God's judgment is to receive God's justice, is to be visited by God's grace. This is what we mean by salvation. This is what we mean when we say we are saved. We are transformed. God's judgment is God's justice, and God's justice is God's grace, and God's grace is divine love trying to save us from ourselves. And this is what we see in the person of Jesus Christ. This is what we Christians worship and hope in. God's transforming, saving grace. It's oftentimes uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable. Oftentimes that grace feels like judgment. The choice is ours, whether to turn and accept the fairness and the righteousness of that judgment or not. Thurgood Marshall was once asked what he thought the ultimate purpose of the NAACP was. And what is the purpose of this organization? This is what Thurgood Marshall said. He said, the purpose of the NAACP is to go out of business. But he elaborated, the purpose of the NAACP is to go out of business with the realization that race is no longer a problem. The murder of Ahmaud Arbery is a reminder, as if we needed another one, but the murder of Ahmaud Arbery is a reminder that race, or rather racism, white supremacy, is still very much a problem. We must be willing to pronounce God's judgment on white supremacy. And we must be willing to be judged by God for our participation. That's especially true for white people like me, to accept God's judgment of white supremacy. Remembering that God's judgment of white supremacy ultimately, not only does it seek to liberate people of color, but it also seeks to liberate white people like me, to give up this illusion of whiteness, to give up the lie of racism. To be judged by God, if we accept and understand the righteousness of that judgment, means that we begin to see God's grace coming to save us. I think that both Amos and Thurgood Marshall alike are trying to teach us this difficult but important truth. God's judgment is God's justice, and God's justice is God's grace. And this grace that we Christians name Jesus Christ, that is our source of hope in a hopeless time.